Rome, in the year 170 AD, during the depths of a merciless winter. The Danube frontier stretches endlessly before you, a desolate expanse where the known world dissolves into barbarian darkness. Snow falls in heavy, muffled silence over the military encampment, each flake a whispered reminder of mortality. Inside a modest canvas tent, barely larger than your own bedroom, a single oil lamp flickers against the encroaching void. The flame trembles with each gust of wind that sweeps down from the Germanic forests, casting restless shadows across weathered parchment and tired hands. Outside, soldiers huddle around dying fires, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the frozen air. The scent of wood smoke mingles with damp wool and the metallic tang of approaching war. This is not the marble splendor of the imperial palace, with its warmth and ceremony. This is the edge of civilization, where comfort dissolves into survival, where even emperors must confront their own fragile humanity. In that tent sits a man who wears the purple of absolute power, yet writes not of conquest, but of surrender. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher-emperor, dips his stylus into ink with hands that tremble, not from fear, but from the bone-deep exhaustion you know so intimately. His back aches with the weight of 50 years and a dozen campaigns. Around him, the Roman world convulses with plague, betrayal, and the slow erosion of certainty. Yet here, in this frozen moment suspended between empire and eternity, he discovers something profound. That peace exists not in the absence of chaos, but in the acceptance of it. You, who are lying there now in your own darkness, 2 millennia distant, carry battles just as real, not against barbarian tribes, but against the relentless invasion of your own thoughts. Tonight, his ancient lamp becomes your beacon. Close your eyes. The journey toward true freedom begins in that distant tent, where snow falls like grace upon a troubled world. The wind across the Pannonian plains carries the voice of desolation itself, a sound that seems to emerge from the very bones of the earth. Picture this, the year 170 AD, deep winter on the Danube frontier, where civilization dissolves into the barbarian darkness beyond. Snow falls in thick, muffled curtains over the Roman encampment, each flake a whispered reminder of mortality. The air is so sharp it feels metallic in the lungs, cutting deeper with each breath. Torches burn low along the perimeter, their flames hissing as they battle the wind, illuminating the tired faces of 10,000 soldiers who huddle around fires that refuse to stay lit in this God-forsaken wilderness. Inside a canvas tent barely larger than your own bedroom, a single oil lamp fights against the encroaching void. Its flame trembles and dances, casting restless shadows across leather-bound scrolls and military maps. Here sits Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, master of the known world, hunched over a wooden campaign desk that wobbles with each movement of his stylus. This is not how you imagine an emperor. There are no marble columns, no gilded ceilings, no crowds shouting his name. There is only worn fabric, a creaking stool, and a fragile body beginning to ache with the weight of 50 years. His hands shake as he writes, not from fear of the Marcomanni tribes gathering beyond the river, but from something far more insidious, the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying too much for too long. The Antonine plague ravages his empire, turning great cities into graveyards. His co-emperor and adopted brother, Lucius Verus, lies dead. Rebellious generals plot in distant provinces. The treasury bleeds gold to fund wars that never seem to end. His own children have been claimed by death's indifferent hand. Here he sits on the edge of the world, trying to hold together an empire that feels increasingly like sand slipping through his fingers. You know this feeling, don't you? You, who are lying there in your own darkness, 2,000 years distant, yet somehow in the exact same place. Perhaps your empire is smaller, a job that demands more than you have to give, relationships that drain rather than nourish, a mind that will not quiet itself. Perhaps your barbarians wear different faces, the mortgage payment looming, the diagnosis hanging in the air, the career that feels like a cage, the loneliness that sits beside you like an uninvited guest. The architecture of anxiety remains unchanged across millennia. The remarkable thing, the thing that should give you pause in your restlessness, is what Marcus chooses to do in this moment of overwhelming circumstance. He does not rage at the gods. He does not drown himself in wine or lose himself in available pleasures. Instead, he picks up his stylus and begins to write not proclamations or military orders, but something far more intimate and desperate. He writes to himself, coaching his own troubled mind through the darkness, building a philosophy not in marble halls, but in the mud and blood of the real world. These writings, his meditations, were never meant for your eyes or mine. They contain no polished rhetoric, no attempt to impress posterity. They are raw, repetitive, sometimes contradictory, the survival notes of a man trying to navigate his own overwhelming anxiety. In that tent, with snow falling and empire crumbling, and his body aching with impossible responsibility, Marcus Aurelius discovers something that might save you tonight. That peace exists not in the absence of chaos, but in the acceptance of it. If an emperor, besieged by death and duty, can find stillness in the heart of winter war, then perhaps there is hope for you too. You are not alone in the dark. Across 2,000 years, he sits there with you, writing by lamplight, proving that the human spirit can forge sanctuary even in the frozen wilderness of its own despair. Consider the physical weight of imperial purple, not merely a color, but a sacred boundary between mortal and divine. The robe itself was suffocating wool, double-dyed in the reeking blood of thousands of murex shellfish, heavy as a yoke across shoulders too young to bear it. To the world, it signified absolute power. To the man trapped within its folds, it was a magnificent prison, each thread woven from the expectations of millions who would never know his name, but demanded his perfection nonetheless. The purple did not begin as privilege, it began as a sentence, handed down before Marcus Aurelius was old enough to understand what he was being condemned to become. He was 17 when Emperor Antoninus Pius adopted him, plucking a quiet, contemplative boy from the relative obscurity of philosophical study and thrusting him into the merciless machinery of imperial succession. There was no consultation, no inquiry into whether this aligned with his authentic desires. Marcus loved books, solitude, the gentle dust of libraries where ideas lived without the weight of consequence. But fate, that indifferent architect of human suffering, had designed a different blueprint for his existence. From that moment forward, his life became a curriculum written by others, every hour accounted for, every relationship strategic, every moment of youth sacrificed on the altar of preparation for a destiny he never requested. Imagine being raised not as a child, but as an institution. The finest minds in Rome descended upon him like sculptors attacking marble. Fronto hammered rhetoric into his reluctant tongue. Junius Rusticus introduced him to the Stoic philosophy that would later save his sanity. Countless advisors schooled him in law, military strategy, and the brutal calculus of power. He learned to wear gravity like others wore tunics, to speak in public when he craved silence, to make decisions affecting millions when he longed only for the simple clarity of contemplation. Every gesture was observed, every word weighed, every mistake quietly corrected in service of a future that felt less like destiny and more like slow suffocation. You know something of this burden, don't you? You, who perhaps studied what practical voices insisted was sensible rather than what set your soul ablaze. You, who took the promotion that came with prestige and salary, but cost you the work that actually mattered. You, who shaped yourself into the person your culture demanded, productive, successful, eternally striving, while the person you might have been withered from neglect like a plant kept in darkness. Modern anxiety is often the soul's rebellion against scripts written by others, the body's protest against a life that fits poorly, like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small while being told to run a marathon that never ends. Marcus spent decades in training for a role he never auditioned for, surrounded by people who saw him not as a human being, but as a future instrument of state power. The expectations were infinite and contradictory. Be strong yet merciful, decisive yet thoughtful, accessible yet dignified, human yet somehow transcendent of human limitation. Every weakness would be exploited by enemies. Every mistake would ripple across continents. Every moment of private suffering would be scrutinized for signs of imperial inadequacy. Perhaps your empire is smaller. A job, a family, a fragile self-image that feels as though it will collapse if you stop holding it upright for even a moment. You wake not to birdsong, but to alarms and notifications. Each one a tiny trumpet calling you back to the battlefield of expectation. Like Marcus, you have learned to anticipate judgment before you act, to hear imagined verdicts before you speak, to measure your worth in the unstable currency of others' approval. Tonight, in this darkness where no one can see you perform, remember this: Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the ancient world, felt exactly as trapped as you do. His cage was golden, but it was still a cage. If he could learn to breathe within his constraints, perhaps there is hope for you to find the same strange freedom within yours. There exists a profound deception hidden within the pages of the book resting beside your restless form tonight. The title, you know, Meditations, is a scholarly invention bestowed centuries after its author returned to dust. Marcus Aurelius never called his writings by this grand name. On the oil-stained papyrus found among his personal effects, scattered across the floor of that frontier tent like fallen leaves, he had inscribed something far more intimate and devastating. Ta is hoton. In the Greek that educated Romans whispered to their souls, it translates to the most vulnerable phrase imaginable: to himself. Let that revelation settle into your consciousness as you lie there in the darkness. To himself. Not to the Senate, not to posterity, not to you, but to the frightened, overwhelmed man trapped inside the purple robes of absolute power. What you are reading when you open these pages is not philosophy. It is eavesdropping. You are witnessing the most powerful human being on earth whispering desperately to his own soul. because there was no one else in the vast machinery of empire whom he could trust with the raw truth of his psychological survival. Consider the extraordinary courage required to write with such unvarnished honesty, even in the supposed safety of privacy. The meditations contain no polished rhetoric designed to impress future generations, no carefully constructed persona of imperial wisdom. Instead, they reveal something almost unbearably human, a man coaching himself through the basic task of getting out of bed each morning. At dawn, he writes in one passage that might have been torn from your own journal, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. Do you hear the tone? This is not the thunderous voice of divine command, but the gentle, weary coaxing of someone who understands intimately the weight of morning dread, the gravitational pull of blankets and avoidance. Throughout the text, Marcus circles back obsessively to the same anxieties, the same remedies, like a man walking worn paths through the landscape of his own troubled consciousness. He reminds himself repeatedly that external events cannot penetrate the fortress of his inner peace, that death is natural and nothing to fear, that the opinions of others are ultimately as substantial as morning mist. But the very repetition betrays the truth. These are not lessons he has mastered, but battles he must fight daily, sometimes hourly. He is not enlightened. He is practicing enlightenment one difficult moment at a time, often failing, always returning to begin again. This creates something precious for you, wrestling with thoughts that refuse to grant you sanctuary. The meditations are not commandments delivered from some superior realm of consciousness. They are breadcrumbs left by a fellow sufferer who navigated this labyrinth before you, who knew with intimate precision the texture of 3 o'clock anxiety, who understood how the mind can become its own most creative torturer. When he writes, you have power over your mind, not outside events, he is not lecturing from a position of mastery. He is desperately reminding himself of something he needs to believe, something his anxious mind keeps forgetting under the relentless pressure of existence. What you hold in your hands, or hear in these words, is the ancient ancestor of every therapeutic practice that has ever offered you comfort. Marcus was conducting what we might now recognize as cognitive restructuring, challenging catastrophic thoughts, building psychological resilience through deliberate mental discipline. But he did this without the vocabulary of modern psychology, guided only by philosophical principles and his own desperate need for inner peace amid outer chaos. You are not receiving wisdom from above. You are reading the survival notes of a companion who sits beside you in the darkness, equally troubled, equally human, equally determined to find some measure of peace before dawn demands everything once again. In the harsh geography of the Danubian frontier, Marcus Aurelius understood that survival depended entirely upon the integrity of one's fortifications. He spent countless hours studying defensive lines, earthworks carved from frozen ground, timber palisades rising against hostile skies, stone ramparts designed to hold back the relentless tide of barbarian chaos. Yet his most profound strategic insight emerged not from military engineering, but from a deeper recognition that the human soul requires a fortress just as impregnable as any legion's encampment, a sanctuary where consciousness can retreat when the world becomes an endless siege of demands and devastation. Picture the quality of that ancient understanding as it applies to your own state of siege tonight. You are not surrounded by Germanic tribes painting their faces for war. Yet you are under assault, nonetheless.
Your barbarians arrive through glowing rectangles that demand attention with every vibration, through email chains that colonize your evening peace, through the sharp intake of breath when memory resurrects some long-buried humiliation. The invasion force is invisible but relentless, family expectations that thunder like catapults against your composure, social anxieties that scale the walls of your confidence, future catastrophes painted in such vivid detail by your imagination that they feel more real than the mattress beneath.
Your tired body. You have lived without walls, allowing the world to march uninvited into the very center of your consciousness, trampling the quiet gardens where peace once grew. Tonight, we shall construct the inner citadel together. Close your eyes and feel the weight of this building project beginning in the depths of your awareness. The foundation must be laid first, thick bedrock carved from acceptance. The understanding that you cannot control the wind, but you can choose which windows to open. Feel this foundation settling beneath you, solid and unshakable, anchored in the recognition that your essential self exists independent of external weather patterns. Now the walls begin to rise, stone by heavy stone. These are not built from denial or avoidance, but from something far more substantial, the disciplined recognition of what belongs to you and what belongs to the chaos beyond. Watch these walls ascending in the darkness behind your closed eyes. They are thick enough to withstand the battering ram of criticism, tall enough to deflect the flaming arrows of judgment, ancient enough to have weathered storms you cannot imagine. The world may scream accusations at these walls, may hurl predictions of failure against their surface, may demand entry with threats and promises alike. Let it rage. The walls have no ears for gossip, no eyes for the frantic movements of markets and social hierarchies, no heart for drama that swirls like dust storms in the wasteland beyond their protection. Within this citadel lies a courtyard where your true self resides, what the Stoics called the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty of consciousness. Here grows a garden that no drought can wither. Here burns a fire that no wind can extinguish. In this sacred space, you are not an employee or a disappointment, not a success or a failure, but simply the awareness that observes these temporary identities without being consumed by them. You are the silence that watches noise, the stillness that remains unmoved while storms exhaust themselves against walls they cannot breach. Feel the profound relief of this separation settling into your bones. The gate opens only from within, and you alone hold the key. Tonight, you need not fix the world or silence its demands. You need only rest within the architecture of your own sovereign soul, finally home. In the guttering lamplight of his frontier tent, surrounded by the desolate whisper of wind through canvas, Marcus Aurelius discovered a technique so radical it threatened the very foundations upon which human suffering rests. He learned to see through the elaborate theatrical costumes that anxiety drapes over simple reality, to peer beneath the ornate masks that transform ordinary events into monuments of terror. This was not cynicism born of disillusionment, but compassion born of necessity, a surgical instrument designed to cut through the tumorous growth of false significance that feeds the restless mind. Consider how he practiced this art of reduction upon the very symbols of his power. The imperial purple robe, for which senators trembled and armies marched, he saw with unflinching clarity, sheep's wool dyed with shellfish blood. The elaborate banquets that displayed Rome's dominance over the known world became, in his private pages, dead fish, dead birds, dead pigs arranged on tables, and fermented grape juice in cups. Even the sexual act, that force which topples kingdoms and drives men to madness, he reduced to its mechanical essence, friction and a convulsion, followed by the expulsion of mucus. These were not the observations of a bitter man, but the survival notes of someone who understood that much of what tormented him existed not in reality, but in the stories he unconsciously wove around reality. Tonight, lying there with thoughts that patrol your consciousness like uninvited guards, you need this same scalpel applied to the swollen phantoms that refuse to grant you peace. That presentation looming in your future, the one your anxious mind has dressed in the costume of career destruction and public humiliation, what is it when stripped of its theatrical garb? People sitting in chairs while you vibrate air with your vocal cords. Sound waves traveling through space to hit eardrums. Bodies occupying a temperature-controlled room. The terror exists not in these simple facts, but in the elaborate narrative of judgment and consequence you have unconsciously authored. Consider the social gathering you dread, where you fear saying the wrong thing and exposing some fundamental inadequacy. Strip it bare, biological organisms exchanging sound patterns, facial muscles contracting in learned expressions, neurons firing in skulls that spend 90% of their energy worrying about their own adequacy, not yours. The judgment you fear is merely electrical activity in someone else's brain. Invisible, transient, utterly incapable of altering your essential worth. Even that embarrassing memory that visits unbidden in these quiet hours, the one that makes you wince years after the fact. Apply Marcus's ruthless reduction. It was seconds of time that dissolved immediately, witnessed by people whose own midnight hours are haunted by their own forgotten mistakes, creating sound waves that dispersed into silence the moment they occurred. Only you have built a monument to something that exists nowhere but in the electrical patterns of your own neural architecture. This practice is not nihilism, but liberation. By seeing things as they actually are rather than as anxiety insists they must be, their power to disturb your peace evaporates like morning mist beneath the unblinking gaze of truth. The monsters were only ever shadows cast by elaborate stories against the wall of consciousness. Strip away the narrative decoration, and what remains is manageable, finite, surprisingly gentle, just the world being itself, without the heavy costume of catastrophe you never meant to dress it in. In the guttering lamplight of his frontier tent, when the weight of empire pressed against his chest like a stone monument, Marcus Aurelius discovered a peculiar form of salvation that required no gods, no prayers, no external intervention whatsoever. He learned to climb, not physically, but through the architecture of perspective itself, to a vantage point so elevated that the screaming chaos of his earthbound existence dissolved into something approaching silence. The Stoics called this practice the view from above, a deliberate expansion of consciousness designed not to escape reality, but to see it with such crystalline clarity that personal suffering finally achieves its proper microscopic proportions within the vast indifference of space and time. Tonight, lying there with thoughts that patrol your consciousness like restless sentries, let us construct this cosmic balcony together in the darkness behind your closed eyes. Begin where anxiety always begins, trapped at ground level, pressed against the immediate texture of your concerns. Feel the mattress supporting your tired body, the sheets settling around your limbs, the specific quality of darkness that holds your room. This is your current altitude, sea level, where every worry feels enormous, where a single embarrassing memory can eclipse the entire sky of consciousness like a thundercloud that refuses to pass. Now, gently, allow your awareness to detach and drift upward through the ceiling, hovering above your building like a ghost observing its former life. See the roof as one small rectangle among thousands in the sleeping city, each one containing its own universe of private suffering. The presentation that terrifies you, the relationship that consumes your midnight thoughts, the financial pressure that sits on your chest. From this modest height, they have already begun to lose their theatrical grandeur, revealed as electrical patterns flickering inside one skull among millions. Continue ascending. Your neighborhood spreads beneath you now, streets forming arteries through which life flows in patterns older than memory, indifferent to the dramas playing out behind illuminated windows. Rise higher still, and your city becomes an organism breathing with traffic and electricity, a complex arrangement of matter that believes itself cosmically significant while occupying a space smaller than a pinprick on the planet's surface. Those emails that demand immediate response, the deadlines that raise your blood pressure, the social missteps that visit you in quiet hours. Can you locate them from this altitude? They exist as invisible disturbances in the thinnest film of atmosphere, gone almost at the moment they arise. Pull back further now, until the curve of Earth becomes visible, that fragile blue marble suspended in velvet void, rotating through space with casual indifference to the anxieties being manufactured in billions of minds across its surface. Here, in the profound silence beyond atmosphere, there is no noise of judgment, no urgency, no audience for the performance you exhaust yourself maintaining. Your entire life, from birth to the death that awaits with patient certainty, is a brief flicker against the backdrop of geological time, itself merely a heartbeat against the slow death of stars. Ascend to the ultimate balcony now, past our medium-sized sun among 400 billion others, past the Milky Way spreading like spilled light across infinite darkness. From this cosmic vantage point, the universe's indifference reveals itself not as cruelty, but as the most generous permission imaginable. Permission to stop performing for an audience that does not exist, to release the exhausting burden of cosmic significance, to recognize that your worth was never measured in achievements or impressions, but in the quiet dignity with which you simply exist, breathe, and endure this brief participation in the vast mystery of being. In the bitter pre-dawn hours when sleep abandoned him entirely, Marcus Aurelius would wrap his military cloak around shoulders that ached with the weight of empire and walk to the banks of the Danube River. There, in the profound silence that exists only in the space between night and morning, he would watch the dark water carry away the remnants of winter, chunks of ice that had seemed so permanent only days before, now dissolving into the relentless current that flowed toward the distant Black Sea. Fallen branches from battles fought upstream, the debris of abandoned encampments, even the reflections of stars that burned with ancient fire overhead. All of it borne away by water that never paused, never reconsidered, never asked permission to take what it would inevitably claim. In those moments of profound observation, Marcus discovered something that would become the cornerstone of his psychological survival. Time itself is a river, and everything you cling to with desperate, white-knuckled determination is already being carried away, whether you consent or not. This was not poetry born of leisure, but a weapon forged in the furnace of necessity. A tool for surviving the particular torture of a mind that insists on treating temporary states as permanent installations in the architecture of existence. You, lying there in darkness that feels so solid and eternal, need this same recognition tonight. Your anxiety performs a peculiar cruelty upon your consciousness by convincing you that this feeling, this problem, this midnight weight pressing against your chest will be your permanent residence. The depression that moves through your days like fog through valleys whispers its most seductive lie. That this grey quality of existence is not weather but climate. Not a passing system, but your new permanent address. Yet the river carries everything, including the heaviness that seems so immovable in this moment. Close your eyes and visualize your current anxieties as objects in your hands, that presentation that terrifies you, the relationship that ended and still visits you in vulnerable hours, the financial pressure that sits like a stone on your sternum. Feel their weight, acknowledge their reality, then step toward the river's edge. Place each burden upon the dark surface and watch as the current takes hold. At first they resist, spinning in place like your thoughts do in these restless hours. Then the ancient flow claims them, carrying them downstream toward the territory where yesterday's emergencies now rest in silt and shadow. Where is the heartbreak that shattered you 3 years ago? Where is the embarrassment that burned your cheeks in childhood? Where is the failure that once felt like the end of the world? The river took them all, dissolved their sharp edges, transformed crisis into memory, and memory into the faint outline of something that once mattered desperately, but now barely disturbs the surface of consciousness. As you listen to your own breathing, notice how each inhale appears, exists briefly, and dissolves into exhale. This is the river rehearsed within your chest, arising, remaining for a moment, passing away. Your current suffering is already moving downstream, already becoming past tense, already joining the vast democracy of dissolved concerns that once felt insurmountable but now rest quietly in the sediment of survived experience. In the suffocating atmosphere of his frontier tent, where every gesture might be interpreted as imperial policy and every expression could ignite rebellion or contempt, Marcus Aurelius discovered one of humanity's most perverse contradictions. Surrounded by senators with carefully neutral faces and soldiers who studied his every movement for signs of strength or weakness, he lived under scrutiny that you and I can barely comprehend. Yet what truly tormented him was not their gaze, but his own mind's willingness to grant them authority over his inner peace. In his private writings, he captured this madness with surgical precision. I have often wondered how it is that every man loves himself more than all the rest of men, but yet sets less value on his own opinion of himself than on the opinion of others. Let that paradox settle into your consciousness as you lie there in the darkness. You, who would defend your beloved friend against criticism with ferocious certainty, somehow grant strangers and acquaintances the power to determine your worth with a glance, a comment, a perceived judgment that exists primarily in the theatre of your imagination. Consider how much of your day is quietly governed by invisible audiences, faces of colleagues, friends, strangers from years past, each one enlisted into an imaginary tribunal that evaluates your every word and gesture. You choose your responses as if a panel of unseen judges were taking notes, replay conversations like crime scenes for evidence of your supposed inadequacy, craft messages then hesitate before sending, as though each line were an exhibit in a trial whose verdict might condemn your entire character. Tonight, Examine these phantom judges with the ruthless clarity Marcus employed when studying his own psychological architecture. Who are these people whose opinions hold such terrifying weight over your peace? The colleague whose approval you desperately seek spends their evening consumed by their own anxieties, not analyzing your performance. That stranger whose imagined judgment haunts you has already forgotten the interaction you replay endlessly in these quiet hours. Even those who do judge you harshly are typically projecting their own unresolved inadequacies onto the convenient screen of your existence, speaking to their own fears rather than any objective reality about your character. Marcus understood this with particular clarity because his imperial position made the absurdity unavoidable. He was simultaneously worshipped as divine and criticized as incompetent, praised for decisions and condemned for the same decisions by different factions. The contradictory judgments revealed a liberating truth. External opinions reflect the internal landscape of the judge far more than any cosmic reality about the judged. These are not gods rendering eternal verdicts, but mortal beings distracted by headaches, worried about their own status, desperately performing their own roles in the same exhausted theatre of social approval. Strip away the power you have unconsciously granted them. That colleague's raised eyebrow was likely indigestion, not condemnation. That friend's delayed response was forgetfulness, not rejection. That acquaintance's glance was boredom, not evaluation. Even when judgment is real, when criticism is spoken aloud, what is it truly? Vibrating air that exists for a moment and vanishes into silence, possessing no physical mass, no ability to harm your character unless you open the gates of your inner citadel and invite it to commit violence against your peace. Why do we hand the keys to our happiness to people we wouldn't trust with our house keys? Why do we let the most unstable currency in the world, the fluctuating opinions of confused mortal humans, determine our self-worth? You exhaust yourself maintaining a performance for an audience too preoccupied with their own inadequacies to notice your stumbles and too temporary to matter in the grand ledger of your existence. Social anxiety is the worship of ghosts, the unconscious belief that somewhere exists a final courtroom where your life will be measured by the shifting moods of others who are themselves lying awake, wondering what people think of them. Tonight, in this sanctuary where no one can observe your performance, commit a quiet act of rebellion. Revoke the authority you have granted to this phantom jury. See each watching face dissolve like breath on a mirror. Their power over you was always contingent upon your belief in their significance. Without that belief, they are revealed as what they always were. Fellow sufferers, equally mortal, equally confused, equally destined to be forgotten by history's relentless current. The only verdict that matters is the one you render in the honest privacy of your own conscience. You are not on trial. There is no cosmic courtroom. There is only you, breathing quietly in the dark, finally granted the revolutionary permission to exist without explanation or apology. In the bitter pre-dawn hours, when sleep fled like a deserter from his frost-covered tent, Marcus Aurelius discovered a form of alchemy so radical it would have been considered madness by his contemporaries. Surrounded by the detritus of endless war, blood-stained dispatches, maps marked with retreating positions, reports of plague consuming his cities, he learned not merely to endure what fate delivered, but to embrace it with something approaching tenderness. The Stoics called this practice amor fati, love of fate, love of what is, even love of the suffering that seemed designed specifically to break his imperial spirit. This was not the bitter resignation of defeat. nor the numb acceptance of the chronically disappointed, but something far more subversive. An active, deliberate embrace of reality in all its uncomfortable, uncooperative magnificence. Consider the profound rebellion hidden within this practice as you lie there wrestling with your own midnight visitation of restlessness. Your mind has been trained by countless voices to believe that peace comes through control, through fixing what is broken, changing what disturbs your equilibrium, eliminating the obstacles that stand between you and the sleep you desperately crave. And so you wage war against the insomnia that keeps you staring at ceiling shadows, against the anxiety that sits on your chest like an uninvited companion, against the racing thoughts that refuse the discipline of quiet. Each moment of this resistance creates what the ancient teachers called the second arrow, a layer of suffering beyond the original discomfort, the self-inflicted wound that whispers you should not feel what you feel, should not be awake when you wish to sleep, should not be struggling when others seem to navigate existence with effortless grace. But Marcus understood something that your anxious mind has forgotten. The war against what is already present is a battle you are guaranteed to lose. Notice what happens in the very act of resistance. The insomnia you fight grows stronger, fed by the adrenaline of battle. The anxiety you try to banish digs deeper roots, nourished by your desperate attention. You have become a soldier fighting an enemy that grows more powerful with each engagement, unaware that the conflict itself is the source of your exhaustion. A blazing fire makes flame and brightness out of everything that is thrown into it, Marcus wrote in his private pages, recognizing that consciousness could transform any obstacle into fuel for its own illumination. Tonight, practice this ancient alchemy in the most immediate way possible. If you are awake, be awake without the story that wakefulness is wrong. If anxiety sits beside you, let it sit without demanding it leave. If your mind races with thoughts, let them race like horses across an open plain, beautiful in their wild energy, even as they refuse your commands. You are not approving of suffering. You are declining to add the suffering of resistance to an already burdened moment. Accept the weight of your body against the mattress. Accept the temperature of air on your skin. Accept even your inability to accept the voice that protests this entire exercise. This is not giving up. This is the most sophisticated form of wisdom. Recognizing that emotions and sensations are weather patterns moving through the vast sky of consciousness. And you do not scream at rain or negotiate with wind. You simply allow weather to be weather. What you discover in this radical acceptance is not the absence of discomfort, but the cessation of war against what cannot be changed. In this surrender, in this willingness to love what is present simply because it is present, you find the only peace that is real, the peace that exists in the center of the storm, not in its absence. There exists a quiet cruelty in the way your mind treats the gift of time, and Marcus Aurelius understood this betrayal with the intimate precision of someone who had watched his own consciousness abandon him repeatedly in moments when presence was most desperately needed. Even as he sat at his campaign desk in that frost-covered tent, stylus moving across parchment that would alter the fate of provinces, his thoughts performed their familiar desertion, leaping forward to imagine disasters at distant frontiers, or spiraling backward into regrets about decisions that could never be recalled from history's merciless archive. His body remained anchored in that single moment, breathing the sharp air of a Danubian winter, yet his mind roamed across decades of suffering that existed nowhere but in the phantom territories of memory and anticipation. You know this dislocation intimately, don't you? You, who lie there in the darkness while your consciousness time travels without your permission, boarding vessels bound for distant catastrophes that may never dock at the harbour of reality. Your body rests here, pressed against fabric and foam, breathing air that belongs neither to yesterday nor tomorrow, but to this eternal now. Yet your mind has abandoned this sanctuary to pace corporate hallways that exist only next week, to replay conversations from years past with surgical precision, as though repetition could somehow rewrite outcomes that have already dissolved into the unchangeable past. In his private writings, Marcus captured the architecture of this suffering with devastating clarity. Confine yourself to the present, he wrote with the urgency of someone who had lost countless hours to temporal exile. He understood that anxiety lives almost exclusively in these ghost lands, dragging you backward into scenes that cannot be altered, or hurling you forward into hypothetical catastrophes that possess no more physical reality than the dreams that visit you in whatever brief sleep exhaustion occasionally grants. You are suffering twice, once in imagination and once in reality, often for events that will never actually occur. Consider the profound simplicity of what Marcus discovered in that frozen tent, surrounded by the infinite demands of empire. Life exists only in the present moment, yet the mind insists on treating this truth as a philosophical abstraction rather than a practical lifeline. Strip away the stories about other moments, the elaborate narratives of regret and anticipation that consume your mental energy, and what remains? This breath entering your lungs. The weight of your head against the pillow. The sound of silence or distant traffic. The temperature of air touching your skin. In this exact moment, divorced from the theatrical productions of memory and imagination, where is the actual emergency? Tonight, let us construct the sanctuary of now together, using the same disciplined tenderness Marcus showed himself in his darkest hours. Imagine your consciousness as a ship that has drifted into dangerous waters, battered by waves of memory and winds of anticipation. Feel the anchor of awareness descending through the churning surface of your thoughts, down through the dark waters of emotion, until it hooks firmly into the bedrock of immediate physical reality. Begin with what cannot lie to you, sensation. Feel the exact weight of your body against the mattress, the specific way your shoulders sink into the softness, the contact of heels and spine, and the back of your skull against fabric. Notice the temperature of the air on your face, cool as it enters your nostrils, slightly warmer as it leaves. These sensations exist in no other moment but this one. They are the only things that are real. Everything else, every worry about tomorrow's presentation, every regret about yesterday's failure, is a story your mind is telling in a language of fear, projected onto the screen of consciousness like shadows on a cave wall. The present moment possesses a quality that past and future can never claim. It is infinitely manageable, precisely because it is infinitely small. You cannot endure a lifetime of anxiety in a single breath, but you can endure this breath. You cannot survive years of potential failure, but you can survive the sensation of your chest rising and falling right now. The present is narrow enough to navigate, immediate enough to bear without the crushing weight of accumulated time pressing against your consciousness like stones in a sack you never agreed to carry. Each time your mind launches another expedition into temporal exile, and it will countless times, because this is what minds do, simply notice the departure and gently escort your attention back to the sanctuary, not with violence or frustration, but with the patient understanding that consciousness is like water. always seeking to flow away from the present moment's simplicity into the complex drama of time's elaborate illusion. Here, you might whisper to yourself with the same tenderness you would show a frightened child. Just here. Just now, Marcus, besieged by wars and plague and the relentless demands of empire, learned to live inside these seconds, to ground his entire being in what his hands could touch, his eyes could see, his breath could carry. The sanctuary you have been seeking does not exist in some future state of enlightenment or past moment of peace. It exists here, in the only moment that is real, the only moment you can actually inhabit. This breath, this heartbeat, this small, manageable now, each one an island of bearable existence in the vast imagined ocean of time. In the bitter depths of winter on the Danube frontier, when frozen corpses were carried back from skirmishes beyond the river like grim harvests from the barbarian darkness, Marcus Aurelius performed a ritual that would have seemed perverse to those who mistook wisdom for weakness. Each morning, before the endless demands of empire could colonize his consciousness, he would sit in the pre-dawn silence of his tent and deliberately contemplate the most forbidden reality of all: his own inevitable death, not with morbid fascination or the theatrical despair of poets, but with the clinical precision of a physician examining the one condition that claims every patient without exception. The oil lamp flickered against canvas walls while he visualized his imperial body returning to the same elemental dust that claimed peasants and kings alike, his purple robes becoming nothing more than expensive shrouds for bones that would be indistinguishable from any other skeleton in history's vast cemetery. This practice, memento mori, remember you must die, was not philosophy's cruelty, but its most compassionate gift. Marcus understood that death was not his enemy, but his most honest teacher. A silent companion who sat beside him through every council of war and whispered perspective into moments of overwhelming anxiety. Alexander the Great and his mule driver both died, he wrote with devastating simplicity. And the same thing happened to both. In that leveling recognition, the crushing weight of imperial responsibility dissolved into proper proportions. If even Alexander returns to dust, what cosmic significance could possibly attach itself to a senator's disapproval or a province's rebellion? You recoil from this contemplation, don't you? You, who have been raised in a culture that treats mortality as an embarrassing medical failure rather than the natural conclusion to every biography ever written. Your civilization has constructed elaborate fortresses of destruction, endless entertainment, perpetual productivity, retirement plans that pretend permanence, all designed to help you forget the singular truth that ancient wisdom insisted you remember. This body breathing in the darkness is temporary. This consciousness observing these words will one day extinguish like a candle meeting wind. And everything you are building will eventually return to the silence from which it briefly emerged. Tonight, in the safety of darkness where honesty costs nothing, allow this skeletal teacher to enter your room and sit quietly at the foot of your bed. Your mind is currently engaged in a frantic game of inflation, transforming temporary discomforts into cosmic catastrophes. That presentation that terrifies you, the relationship that ended and still haunts you, the career setback that keeps you staring at shadows, your anxiety insists these are emergencies of universal significance. Death, with its patient smile, suggests otherwise. Imagine just for a moment that this is your final night. Feel the weight of that possibility settling gently into your chest. Suddenly, remarkably, the things that tormented you 5 minutes ago begin to lose their terrifying solidity. Marcus lived with mortality as an intimate advisor. The Antonine Plague had already claimed several of his children. That particular grief that breaks parents in ways they never fully repair. He watched young soldiers, boys with barely enough years to have formed memories worth keeping, wrapped in blood-stained cloaks and carried back to camp. He felt his own body aging, joints stiffening. The slow erosion that whispers its message in a language the body understands before the mind accepts its translation. Yet this proximity to death did not crush him, it liberated him to focus on what actually deserved his limited attention. Let the trivial concerns fall away now like leaves in autumn. Let the fear of judgment evaporate in the light of this ultimate truth. You are mortal, fragile, temporary, and in that fragility lies your freedom. Nothing that worries you tonight can survive the grave. The silence that awaits us all is not empty. It is filled with the peace of finally putting down the heavy burden of self-importance. Sleep now, knowing that everything is passing, everything is dissolving, and in the grand democracy of death, your anxieties are beautifully, mercifully insignificant. In the suffocating complexity of his frontier command, where a single miscalculation could doom entire legions to frozen death beyond the Danube, Marcus Aurelius confronted the most dangerous illusion that destroys powerful men, the belief that authority over armies translates into authority over outcomes. Plague ravaged his cities despite every sacrifice to the gods. Barbarian tribes crossed frozen rivers despite reinforced borders. Trusted generals plotted rebellion in distant provinces despite years of imperial favor. The machinery of empire ground forward according to laws utterly indifferent to his will, yet every consequence still arrived at his tent like a personal accusation. In that unbearable tension between responsibility and impotence, he discovered the principle that would save his sanity and perhaps yours tonight. The Stoics called it the dichotomy of control, and it divided the entire chaotic universe into two uncompromising territories with no neutral ground between them. Everything that exists, every circumstance, every relationship, every source of anxiety that visits you in these restless hours falls decisively into one of two categories: things within your power and things forever beyond it. You control exactly three things: your judgments about events, your responses to circumstances, and the cultivation of your character. Everything else belongs to fate, to nature, to the vast machinery of cause and effect that operates with complete indifference to your midnight worry. You have been living outside your rightful kingdom, haven't you? You who lie there exhausted from trying to govern territories where you hold no citizenship. You replay conversations, editing your words as though the past were a draft awaiting revision. You rehearse tomorrow's presentation, attempting to script outcomes that depend on variables you cannot predict: the mood of your audience, the questions they will ask, the mysterious alchemy of impression formation occurring in minds you cannot access. You catastrophize about potential disasters, treating anxiety as though it were a form of prevention, as though sufficient worry could somehow inoculate you against an uncontrollable future. Marcus understood that this confusion about jurisdiction is the source of most human misery. We exhaust ourselves trying to hold water in our hands, then feel like failures when it inevitably slips through our fingers. Your anxiety right now is the specific friction created by attempting to control what cannot be controlled. The grinding of gears that were never meant to mesh. The exhaustion of pushing against walls that will never move regardless of how much force you apply. You have been trying to colonize the uncontrollable, and your spirit is breaking under the strain of this impossible imperial project. Imagine unclenching a fist that has been closed so tightly for so long that the muscles have begun to spasm. That fist is your desire to control outcomes. Feel the immediate relief as your hands release things they were never meant to hold. Other people's opinions, future events, past mistakes, the weather of tomorrow's circumstances. You cannot control whether you fall asleep tonight, but you can control whether you lie here peacefully or wage war against wakefulness. You cannot control whether people approve of you, but you can control whether you grant their approval authority over your inner sanctuary. Marcus found a strange, unshakable dignity in this recognition. When outcomes favored him, he accepted them without arrogance, knowing they were never fully his achievement. When they turned against him, he bore them without collapse, knowing they were never fully his failure. You are responsible for your character, your effort, your response to this moment, and nothing more. The universe is not asking you to control everything. That was always an impossible burden you assigned yourself. Tonight, resign from the exhausting position you never applied for, general manager of reality itself. Return your attention to the only territory you actually inhabit. This breath, this choice to release the burden of false responsibility. Let the world spin without your supervision. The relief spreading through your chest is the specific peace of finally accepting the natural boundaries of human power, resting in the profound sanctuary of limited, manageable responsibility. In the profound solitude of his frontier command, where 10,000 Roman soldiers huddled around dying fires against the merciless Danubian winter, Marcus Aurelius experienced a vision that shattered the boundaries of his imperial consciousness. Looking out across the sprawling encampment, he no longer saw separate men nursing private fears and homesick longings, but a single, breathing organism stretched along the frozen riverbank. Each campfire was not an isolated point of light, but a glowing organ in a vast body that extended beyond the edges of sight. The sentries walking their lonely circuits were not solitary guardians, but circulating blood cells in a living system that breathed, suffered, and endured as one indivisible whole. In that moment of recognition, the crushing weight of carrying an empire alone dissolved into something far more bearable. The understanding that he had never actually been carrying it alone at all. You, lying there in your separate room, wrapped in the suffocating certainty of your isolation, are caught in the same illusion that torments every anxious consciousness, the belief that your suffering is uniquely yours, sealed inside your skull like a secret prison that no one else can enter or understand. Modern existence has perfected this deception of separateness. You live in boxes stacked upon boxes, communicate through screens that filter out the warmth of presence, measure your worth against curated images of others who seem to inhabit a different, more successful universe. This perceived isolation amplifies every fear, making your struggles feel shameful, unbearable, and utterly without precedent in human experience. Yet even now, as these words reach your consciousness, you are participating in an intimacy so profound that your anxious mind cannot fully comprehend its scope. The atoms forming your hands were forged in the nuclear furnaces of dying stars that exploded billions of years before Rome dreamed itself into existence, scattering their elemental dust across the cosmos to eventually assemble into the form breathing quietly in your bed. The oxygen filling your lungs has been breathed by dinosaurs, by ancient emperors, by medieval peasants, by the very people whose judgment you fear tomorrow morning. You are not observing the universe from some separate vantage point. You are the universe observing itself through the temporary aperture of your particular consciousness. The Stoics called this recognition sympathia, the understanding that all things participate in a single, interconnected web of existence, where boundaries dissolve under the patient gaze of wisdom. When you truly grasp this fundamental unity, the sharp edges of resentment and self-judgment begin to soften like ice in spring sunlight. That colleague who frustrates you, that stranger whose imagined disapproval haunts your midnight hours, that family member who seems incapable of understanding your struggles. They are not enemies from foreign territories, but other expressions of the same consciousness that peers out from behind. Your eyes, perhaps confused, perhaps in pain, perhaps temporarily forgetting their essential nature, just as you have forgotten yours. Your anxiety stems from the exhausting belief that you must face existence as a solitary warrior defending a fragile fortress against infinite threats. But sympathia whispers a different truth. You are supported by a web of connection that requires no effort to maintain, because it is the fundamental architecture of reality itself. Your suffering is not a personal defect, but participation in the universal human experience of struggle. Your loneliness is not evidence of cosmic rejection, but the shared condition of consciousness, believing itself separate from the whole that it has never actually left. Tonight, let the walls of isolation dissolve into this vast, comforting recognition. You belong to the silent community of the sleepless, the anxious, the questioning, millions of others staring at their own ceilings, wrestling with thoughts that echo your own across the darkness. You are woven into the fabric of everything that breathes, held by forces that existed before your birth and will continue beyond your death. Rest in this ancient truth: you have never been alone, because separation was always the illusion, and unity the only reality that has ever existed. In the flickering lamplight of his frontier tent, surrounded by dispatches that seemed to announce the world's unprecedented collapse, plague-ravaging cities, barbarians massing beyond frozen rivers, trusted generals plotting rebellion in distant provinces, Marcus Aurelius opened the weathered scrolls of Heraclitus and discovered something that transformed his relationship with suffering itself. The ancient Greek philosopher, writing 5 centuries before Rome even dreamed of empire, described anxieties that felt startlingly familiar. Different names, different cities, yet the same essential fears: the terror of judgment, the weight of responsibility, the crushing sense that one's particular moment in history represented some unique catastrophe requiring extraordinary solutions. This recognition crystallized into what would become his most potent source of comfort: the understanding that history is not linear progress, but circular repetition, the same fundamental dramas playing out in endless variation across the centuries. Consider how the same things occur again and again, he wrote, with the weary patience of someone who had finally stopped being surprised by humanity's predictable patterns. The dramas are the same, only the actors change. What felt like personal failure or unprecedented crisis revealed itself as participation in an ancient script that countless others had performed before him, and countless more would perform long after his bones had turned to dust beneath forgotten battlefields. You believe your era is uniquely challenging, don't you? You, who scroll through headlines, convinced that previous generations lived in simpler times. that your parents and grandparents faced obstacles less psychologically complex than the specific anxieties colonizing your midnight consciousness. But strip away the surface details, the technology, the terminology, the particular costumes of each epoch, and what remains? Social anxiety is not a modern invention born of social media, but an ancient adaptation. The same fear of tribal rejection that kept your ancestors vigilant in communities where exile meant death. The existential dread that wakes you at 3 in the morning has been waking philosophers and peasants alike for millennia, each one believing their particular experience of cosmic uncertainty was somehow unprecedented. Your great-great-grandmother lay awake in her own darkness, her mind racing with concerns about adequacy and belonging, using different vocabulary to describe the identical emotional weather that visits you tonight. Medieval courtiers feared social rejection while navigating dangerous palace intrigues. Sumerian merchants worried about future catastrophes while watching storm clouds gather over trade routes that no longer exist on any map. The crushing weight of responsibility that sits on your chest has sat on the shoulders of tribal chieftains, Roman generals, and countless others who believed they carried burdens no one else could understand. There is profound medicine hidden within this recognition for someone suffering from the peculiar arrogance of anxiety.
Your mind insists that your struggles are catastrophic anomalies, requiring solutions you feel incapable of generating. But you are not pioneering new territory in the landscape of suffering, you are walking well-worn paths that billions have navigated before you. Your fears are not evidence of personal defect but confirmation of your full participation in the timeless human condition, ancient recurring themes in the grand symphony of consciousness that has been playing since humans first developed the capacity for self-reflection.
Tonight, let this recognition settle into your bones like warmth, returning to frozen limbs. You are not alone in the dark, you are accompanied by the ghosts of every anxious soul who has ever lain awake, wondering if they were enough, if they would survive, if morning would bring relief. The wheel turns, the story repeats, and you are safe within the rhythm of the eternal return, carried by the same ancient resilience that flows in your blood from ancestors who survived nights far darker than this one. The oil lamp in Marcus Aurelius's tent flickers its final dance against the encroaching darkness, its flame drawing inward like a dying star, smaller and smaller until it becomes a single point of amber light trembling against the vast night. Watch it fade, this last guardian against shadow, as it consumes the final drops of fuel that have sustained it through hours of imperial meditation. The light grows dim, then dimmer still, casting ever softer shadows across weathered scrolls and military maps that no longer demand attention. Outside, snow falls with the profound silence of eternity itself, each flake settling upon frozen ground with the gentleness of a blessing, covering the footprints of centuries, softening the sharp edges of fortifications, burying the evidence of human struggle under a blanket of pure indifference. Peace. The Emperor's hand grows still upon his knee. There are no more words to write tonight, no more consolations to whisper to his troubled soul, no more battles to fight against the inexorable tide of circumstance. His breathing slows, matching the rhythm of the sleeping camp, the rhythm of the river flowing beneath its armor of ice, the rhythm of the earth itself turning through space with patient indifference to the anxieties of mortals who believe their worries matter to the cosmos. You, too, have reached that edge where thinking must finally surrender to something older and more absolute. The day loosens its grip on your consciousness now, all its sharp remarks and awkward silences, its unfinished tasks and unreturned messages dissolving like salt in water. You need not carry these fragments of yesterday into this sacred hour. Let them fall away, one by one, returning to the silence from which they briefly emerged. The future, too, begins its gentle dissolution, all those imagined conversations and fragile plans, the delicate scaffolding of hope and fear that your mind constructed around tomorrow's uncertainty. What has not yet come cannot be managed from this bed, from this breath, from this moment that exists in no other time but now. Even the self you have been defending all day softens at its edges like ice meeting spring. The name you answer to, the history you carry, the private verdicts you have rendered about your worth. All of this can be set down beside the bed like clothes removed before sleep. You are not required to be anyone in particular just now. Not successful or failing, not impressive or inadequate, not strong or weak. In this darkness, you are simply a breathing animal returning to the first truth: you exist, and that is enough. The words themselves begin to thin, like soldiers dismissed from their posts at dawn, thoughts slow, repeating in soft, harmless circles that spiral towards silence. The snow falls. It has always fallen. It will always fall. The lamp fades. It has always faded. It will always fade. You are safe. You have always been safe. You will always be safe. Breath in, breath out. In and out. The body grows heavier, sinking back into the ancient earth that has held every sleeper who ever lived. There is nothing left to prove, nothing left to remember, nothing left to become. Only this breathing, this darkness, this great enveloping silence that asks nothing except that you rest. The snow falls. The world grows quiet. Your eyes close. Sleep comes like tide returning to shore, natural as breathing, gentle as snowfall, carrying you into the vast peace that waits beyond thought, beyond worry, beyond the beautiful burden of being human. Rest now. Rest. Rest.